January 17, 1940. Eastern France. The Maginot Line. The morning fog clung to the frozen earth like a shroud. German reconnaissance units crouched in the tree line, binoculars pressed against cold steel, watching the French positions through the mist. They had been told this would be simple, that the enemy's armor was outdated, slow, cumbersome relics of the Great War. The Reich's Panzer doctrine promised speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. The reports from high command painted a picture of superiority so complete that victory seemed a matter of paperwork, not bloodshed. Yet in the distance, through the fog, something massive moved. Its silhouette was wrong, too heavy, too angular. The sound of its engine was not the familiar growl they expected, but something deeper, more deliberate. The German observers watched, unblinking, as the shape emerged from a mist. It was a Char B1 bis. Its 75mm howitzer pointed directly at their position. In that instant, the certainty they carried across the border began to crack. The German Wehrmacht entered the Second World War with a doctrine built on speed and shock. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, depended on rapid penetration, encirclement, and the psychological collapse of enemy forces before they could organize resistance. The Panzer divisions were the spearhead of this philosophy, and their commanders believed they possessed not only tactical superiority, but technological dominance. German intelligence had assessed the armor of France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually the United States. The reports concluded that enemy tanks were either too slow, too lightly armed, or too poorly coordinated to challenge the Wehrmacht's combined arms approach. This confidence was not arrogance. It was a result of meticulous planning, recent victories in Poland, and the institutional memory of a military culture that prided itself on precision. But warfare is not a static equation. It is a living, breathing organism that evolves under pressure, and the tanks that rolled onto the battlefields of Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific would force German commanders to confront a reality they had not anticipated. The Char B1 bis was the first shock. French tank doctrine prioritized heavy armor and infantry support over speed, and the Char B1 embodied this philosophy completely. It weighed 32 tons and carried armor up to 60 millimeters thick, far beyond what German anti-tank guns in 1940 could penetrate at range. Its 75mm howitzer, mounted in the hull, could destroy fortifications and enemy armor with a single shot. German tankers, accustomed to engaging light Polish cavalry tanks and the occasional British Matilda, found themselves facing a machine that absorbed their rounds without flinching. In the Battle of Stan, a single Char B1 bis commanded by Captain Pierre Ballat engaged German forces for hours, destroying 13 panzers and taking 140 hits without being disabled. The tank withdrew only when it ran out of ammunition. German after-action reports noted the unexpected resilience of French heavy armor, and for the first time, Panzer commanders requested heavier guns and thicker plating. The myth of invincibility had been tested, and it had bent. They expected rolling coffins. They encountered fortresses on treads. The Wehrmacht's Panzer III and Panzer IV were designed for mobility and coordination, not slugfests with heavy armor. When the invasion of France began in earnest, German tank crews found themselves outgunned and out-armored by French heavy tanks. The psychological impact was immediate. Confidence, so carefully cultivated through training and propaganda, gave way to caution. Tank commanders who had advanced with aggressive speed began to hesitate, calling for artillery and air support before engaging enemy armor. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, so effective in Poland, was forced to adapt. The French campaign was ultimately won through superior strategy and coordination, but the cost in German armor was higher than anticipated, and the lessons learned would reshape Panzer design for the remainder of the war. Then came the Soviet Union. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. German forces crossed the border with 3 million men, 3,000 aircraft, and over 3,000 tanks. Intelligence assessments predicted the collapse of Soviet resistance within weeks. The Red Army was considered disorganized, poorly led, and equipped with obsolete machinery. The initial weeks of the campaign seemed to confirm this analysis. Soviet units were encircled and destroyed in staggering numbers. But then the Germans encountered the KV-1. The Kleinwaffenvorschilf tank was a colossus. It weighed 45 tons and carried armor up to 90 millimeters thick on the turret. Its 76mm gun could penetrate any German tank at combat range. More importantly, it was nearly impervious to German anti-tank weapons. The standard 37mm anti-tank gun, the backbone of German infantry defense, was useless against the KV-1. Even the 50mm gun on the Panzer III could only penetrate the KV-1's armor at point-blank range, and only with luck. German soldiers began to report encounters with Soviet tanks that simply would not die. One KV-1, commanded by Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov, held a critical road junction near Krasny Gvardisk for hours, destroying 22 German tanks before withdrawing. Another, damaged and immobilized, continued to fire on German positions for an entire day, tying down an entire regiment. German engineers were forced to bring up 88mm anti-aircraft guns, the only weapon capable of reliably destroying the KV-1, to deal with individual tanks. The psychological effect was profound. German infantry, who had been taught that tank support and anti-tank guns would protect them, now faced machines that absorbed entire magazines of fire without slowing. Panic spread in whispers. The word unzerstörbar, indestructible, began appearing in after-action reports. They expected to sweep aside peasants in scrap metal. They encountered monsters that devoured their doctrine. The KV-1 was followed by the T-34, a tank that would come to define the Eastern Front. The T-34 was not the heaviest or the most heavily armed tank of the war, but it was the most balanced. It combined sloped armor, a powerful 76mm gun, wide tracks of mobility, and a diesel engine for range and reliability. German tankers, accustomed to facing tanks that were either well-armored but slow or fast but lightly armed, found themselves outmatched on every metric that mattered. The T-34 sloped armor deflected rounds that would have penetrated flat plating. Its gun could destroy Panzer IIIs and IVs from ranges where German tanks could not return effective fire. Its wide tracks allowed it to traverse mud and snow that bogged down German armor. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Panzer doctrine, wrote in his memoirs that the T-34 was the finest tank in the world and that encountering it was a severe psychological shock. German tank development was forced into overdrive. The Panther and Tiger tanks were direct responses to the T-34 and KV-1, attempts to regain the technological edge that had been lost in the forests and steppes of Russia. But it was not only the Soviets who surprised the Germans. In North Africa, British Matilda II tanks proved nearly invulnerable to Italian and early German anti-tank weapons. The Matilda's 78mm of frontal armor made it immune to most threats, and during Operation Compass, a handful of Matildas spearheaded the destruction of 10 Italian divisions. German forces in North Africa were forced to deploy 88mm guns in direct fire roles, sacrificing their anti-aircraft capabilities to counter British armor. Later, the arrival of American M4 Sherman tanks introduced a new kind of challenge, not technological superiority, but overwhelming numbers and logistical reliability. The Sherman was not better armored or better armed than German tanks, but it was produced in staggering quantities, maintained in the field with ease, and crewed by men who could afford to lose 10 tanks to destroy one Tiger because 10 more were already on their way. The symbolic object of this war was not the tank itself, but the fuel that powered it. German panzers ran on gasoline, a resource the Reich never possessed in sufficient quantities. Soviet and American tanks ran on diesel and the industrial capacity of nations that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Every tank destroyed by German forces was a tactical victory and a strategic defeat, because for every one they knocked out, 2 more appeared. The rumble of diesel engines became the sound of inevitability, the mechanical heartbeat of nations that could outproduce, outlast, and overwhelm through sheer abundance. By 1943, the German military was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. The Tiger I, with its 88mm gun and thick armor, could dominate any battlefield where it appeared, but there were never enough of them. The Panther, a response to the T-34, was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was complex, expensive, and plagued by mechanical issues. Meanwhile, the Allies produced tanks by the tens of thousands. The Soviet Union alone built over 50,000 T-34s. The United States produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. Germany, for all its engineering prowess, produced only 6,000 Panthers and fewer than 1,400 Tigers. The arithmetic of war had shifted from quality to quantity, and no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome the simple reality that the enemy had more tanks, more fuel, more steel, and more men willing to crew them. The German commanders who survived the war spoke of these encounters in memoirs and interviews. They described the shock of seeing their rounds bounce off Soviet armor, the frustration of watching American tank columns stretch to the horizon, the grim realization that the war movement they had pioneered was being turned against them. General Erhard Rouse wrote that encountering the T-34 was like a predator meeting another predator for the first time and realizing it is not alone at the top of the food chain. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein noted that the greatest German failure was not tactical or strategic, but industrial, the inability to match the productive capacity of their enemies. The German soldier, trained to believe in the superiority of German engineering and the inevitability of German victory, was forced to confront the limits of both. The tanks that surprised German commanders were not merely machines. They were embodiments of ideology, symbols of the industrial democracies and totalitarian states that built them. The T-34 represented Soviet collectivism, mass production driven by state control, and the willingness to sacrifice refinement for quantity. The Sherman represented American pragmatism, a tank designed not to be the best, but to be good enough, reliable enough, and numerous enough to win through attrition. The Char B1 and Matilda represented the old European powers, clinging to doctrines of heavy armor and infantry support even as the nature of war evolved. Each tank forced the Germans to adapt, to question, to redesign. But adaptation requires time and resources, and by the time the Panthers and Tigers rolled off the production lines, the war was already lost. The fog that hung over the Maginot Line in January 1940 was the same fog that clung to the Kursk salient in July 1943, the same fog that obscured the Ardennes in December 1944. It was a fog of certainty dissolving into doubt, of doctrine crumbling under the weight of reality. The German commanders who entered the war believing in their technological and tactical superiority left it knowing that superiority is not a static condition. It is a fleeting advantage, earned through innovation and lost through complacency. The tanks that surprised them were not miracles of engineering. They were the products of nations that understood a simple truth. In total war, the side that can build more, fuel more, and crew more will prevail, no matter how advanced the enemy's design. And so the diesel engines rumbled on, across Europe, across North Africa, across the steppes of Russia, carry with them the inexorable logic of industrial warfare, the sound of abundance, the sound of democracy, the sound of empires falling beneath the treads of tanks they never expected to face.